Sometimes history changes not because of orders or battles, but because one person refuses to ignore another person's hunger. The morning the line almost broke began like every other morning inside Camp Briarwood. The bell rang at 6 a.m. sharp, a dull iron sound that rolled across the compound and bounced off the long wooden barracks like a habit the world had learned not to question. The sky above the camp was pale and thin, the kind of early light that made everything look unfinished. Beyond the fence, the Kansas prairie stretched for miles, flat and quiet, the grass silver with dew, and the air already warming toward what would become a hot July day. Inside the camp, routine moved with mechanical precision. Boots struck gravel. Tin cups clinked. Guards walked their assigned paths with the steady rhythm of men who had repeated the same circuit 1,000 times. Camp Briarwood held a little over 800 German prisoners of war that summer, men captured in the final months of a war that had already begun fading into memory for many Americans. Most of them worked the nearby farms during the day, helping harvest wheat that grew tall and golden across the surrounding counties. The farmers needed hands. The army needed order. The camp provided both. Every morning the prisoners formed a line outside the mess hall to receive breakfast before the work trucks arrived. Bread, oatmeal, coffee that smelled stronger than it tasted. Nothing extravagant, nothing cruel either. Just enough to keep men standing upright and capable of work beneath the wide Midwestern sun. That morning the line formed as it always did, a slow row of gray uniforms stretching across the packed dirt yard. Some men stared at the ground. Some watched the sky. A few whispered in low German, voices careful and quiet. They had learned that silence made the days pass more smoothly. At the edge of the yard, near the medical tent, Lieutenant Evelyn Parker stepped out into the morning air with a clipboard tucked under one arm. She had arrived at Briarwood only 3 weeks earlier, transferred from a military hospital in Missouri, where she had spent 2 years tending to soldiers who came home thinner, quieter, and older than their age. Evelyn was 28, tall and composed, the kind of nurse who carried calm with her the way others carried a watch or a pen. Her uniform was always pressed, her hands always steady. She believed in procedure because procedure saved lives. In war, structure was a kind of mercy. The medical tent stood slightly apart from the rest of the compound, its canvas walls pale against the dust. From there Evelyn could see the entire breakfast line stretching toward the mess hall door. She watched it the way she watched most things in the camp, quietly, carefully, noticing details others overlooked. A man coughing into his sleeve, another adjusting the loose belt of his uniform. Small signs that told her which bodies were holding together and which were beginning to struggle. Most mornings there was nothing unusual to report. Camp Briarwood ran clean and efficient. The command staff prided themselves on that. Colonel Thomas Reed, the camp commander, was known for saying that discipline and fairness were the two pillars that kept a prison from becoming something worse. Evelyn had met him only once during her orientation. He was a tall man with calm gray eyes and a voice that rarely needed to rise above conversation. He believed in rules, and so did she. The line shuffled forward another step. A guard near the gate checked his watch. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen windows. And then Evelyn noticed the man near the middle of the line. At first it was only a slight imbalance, the way his shoulders leaned forward while the rest of him tried to remain upright. The prisoners stood close together, shoulder to shoulder, and most guards would not have noticed anything unusual. But Evelyn had spent too many years studying the quiet language of exhausted bodies. The man swayed once, barely more than an inch, then steadied himself. His hands hung loosely at his sides. His uniform jacket looked 2 sizes too large, the fabric collapsing around a frame that had grown narrow from months of poor appetite and long days of work. His hair, once dark blonde, had faded toward a dusty wheat color under the sun. For a moment he seemed to gather himself, straightening his back with the careful pride of someone determined not to draw attention. Then his head dipped slightly as if the ground had suddenly moved closer. Evelyn stepped forward instinctively, stopping just outside the edge of the line. She did not speak yet. She simply watched. The man inhaled slowly through his nose, a deliberate breath, like someone measuring the distance between strength and collapse. He was young, perhaps 25, though the camp made ages difficult to guess. Hunger and fatigue had a way of compressing time. The prisoners ahead of him moved another step forward toward the mess hall door. He followed half a second later, a fraction slower than the others. His boots dragged lightly across the dirt. Evelyn glanced at the clipboard in her hand, scanning the medical list from the previous evening. No serious cases reported. A few minor fevers. One sprained wrist. Nothing that should have produced the look she was seeing now. The man shifted again, this time placing a hand briefly against the wooden post beside the walkway. It was a small movement, almost polite, as though he did not want the post to notice it was being used for support. Evelyn stepped closer. The guards did not object. Nurses moved through the camp freely during morning checks. From 10 feet away, she could see the hollowness in the man's cheeks and the faint gray shadow beneath his eyes. He stared straight ahead, focused on the mess hall door like it was a destination that required absolute concentration. A second passed, then another. The line advanced once more. The man took one step forward, and his knees nearly forgot how to follow. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden fall, no cry for help. Just a brief tilt of gravity, the quiet moment when a body stops pretending it has enough strength left to argue with the earth. Evelyn moved the last few steps toward him just as his hand reached for balance again. Up close, she could see the small tremor in his fingers. Not fear, not illness. Something simpler. Something older than war. Hunger. The kind that hollowed out patience and left a person measuring the world in bites instead of hours. Around them, the line continued to move toward the mess hall door. Guards watched the yard. Coffee steamed in metal containers inside the kitchen. And for a brief moment in the middle of a perfectly ordered morning, Evelyn Parker stood looking at a starving man who was trying very hard not to become anyone's problem. The man steadied himself before anyone else in the line noticed. His hand remained on the wooden post for one quiet second, fingers spread against the rough grain as if he were measuring the distance between standing and falling. Then he pulled his hand away and straightened again, forcing his shoulders back into the posture expected of every prisoner in Camp Briarwood. Lieutenant Evelyn Parker watched him without speaking. She had learned long ago that sudden attention could embarrass a patient more than help him. Some men would rather collapse than admit weakness in front of strangers, especially men who had already lost everything else. The breakfast line moved forward another slow step. The smell of fresh bread drifted out through the open mess hall window, warm and simple. For most men, it was just breakfast. For a man whose stomach had been empty too long, the smell alone could feel like gravity pulling the body forward. Evelyn walked along the side of the line, clipboard tucked beneath her arm, her boots pressing softly into the dusty ground. The guards nodded as she passed. Nurses came and went freely through the compound during morning checks. She stopped beside the man as the line paused again. Up close, she could see details the distance had hidden. His collarbone pressed sharply against the fabric of his jacket. The skin at the edge of his jaw had the pale gray tone that came from too little food and too much sun. His lips were dry but tightly set, as though he had made a private promise not to show weakness. The name tag sewn roughly onto his uniform jacket read Keller. Matthias Keller. The letters were faded but still clear enough to read. Evelyn glanced down at her clipboard again and turned a page slowly. The medical roster listed every prisoner who had visited the tent in the last 2 weeks. There it was near the bottom of the list. Keller, Matthias. Age 26. Former mechanical technician. No disciplinary record. No recent medical visits. She looked back up at him. The absence of visits told her something important. Men who never appeared at the medical tent were often the ones who needed it most. Pride could be as stubborn as illness. The line advanced again. Keller stepped forward carefully, the way someone walked when every movement had to be calculated to avoid revealing weakness. A guard at the mess hall door lifted a clipboard and called. The next group inside. Metal trays clattered softly on the serving counter. Oatmeal steamed in large steel containers. The morning routine continued with the quiet efficiency that defined the camp. Evelyn watched Keller breathe. His chest rose slowly and fell even more slowly, as though each breath had to travel farther than it should. When he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his knees trembled once and then steadied again. It was a small tremor, the kind most people would miss. Nurses did not miss those things. Evelyn spoke quietly, her voice calm and even. Mr. Keller. The man did not turn immediately. For a moment, it seemed as though the sound of English had to travel through a layer of exhaustion before reaching him. Then he looked toward her. His eyes were a clear gray blue, alert despite the fatigue that surrounded them. He understood the language. Many of the prisoners did. The American guards had learned a few German words as well. Language inside the camp had become a mixture of necessity and patience. "Are you feeling well this morning?" she asked. The question was simple but precise. It did not accuse him of weakness. It offered him the choice to speak honestly. Keller hesitated. His eyes moved briefly toward the line ahead of him, then back to her. For a second, she thought he might deny everything and move forward with the others. Instead, he answered in careful English, each word measured. "I am able to stand, Lieutenant." The response was polite and almost formal. Evelyn recognized the quiet dignity in it immediately. It was not the answer of a man complaining. It was the answer of a man trying very hard not to become anyone's burden. The line moved again. Keller stepped forward with it. The motion seemed to cost him more effort than the last one. Evelyn walked beside him for a few paces. "How long since your last proper meal?" she asked softly. Keller looked straight ahead toward the mess hall door. The sunlight touched the side of his face, revealing the fine lines of strain around his eyes. "I ate yesterday evening," he said after a moment. "Bread and soup." His voice remained steady, but something in the way he paused between words told Evelyn the truth was not that simple. Hunger was rarely about one missed meal. It was about the slow arithmetic of too little food over too many days. Evelyn studied him for another second. In the distance, a work truck engine started, coughing once before settling into a low idle. Soon the prisoners would be loaded into the back and driven out to the wheat fields that surrounded the camp. A full day of work waited under the Kansas sun. For a healthy man, it was exhausting. For a man like Keller, it might be impossible. The line paused again. The mess hall door opened, and another group stepped inside to receive their trays. Keller swayed once more, just slightly, as though the earth beneath his boots had tilted. His hand lifted halfway toward the wooden post beside him, but he stopped himself before touching it again. Pride had a remarkable ability to compete with gravity. Evelyn reached out and touched his sleeve lightly. Not a command, not a restraint, just a signal that someone had noticed. "Mr. Keller," she said quietly. "Look at me." He did. For the first time since she had approached him, his focus shifted fully away from the mess hall door. Up close, the tiredness in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the look of someone who had been measuring strength hour by hour and realizing there was not much left to measure. "You are going to step out of the line," she said. Keller blinked once, surprised but not offended. He glanced toward the guards and then back at her. "Am I ill?" he asked. The question held genuine confusion. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "Not ill," she said. "Just tired enough that I would like to examine you before you go to the fields today." Keller considered the offer in silence. Around them, the line continued moving forward. Men passed them without comment, trays in their hands, the smell of oatmeal drifting across the yard. Finally, Keller nodded once. "Very well, Lieutenant," he said quietly. He stepped aside from the line and followed her toward the medical tent, walking slowly but upright. The guards at the edge of the yard watched them go, but did not interfere. Nurses had authority to remove a prisoner from work detail if health required it. That was part of the structure that kept the camp functioning smoothly. As they approached the canvas tent, the morning sun climbed higher above the prairie, warming the air and brightening the wide sky beyond the fence. Evelyn lifted the flap and gestured for Keller to enter. Inside the tent, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. A wooden examination table stood near the back wall beside a small metal cabinet filled with medical supplies. Keller stepped inside and paused just beyond the doorway. For a moment, he seemed uncertain where to stand. Evelyn set her clipboard on the table and turned toward him. "Please sit," she said, pointing to a simple wooden chair near the examination table. Keller lowered himself carefully into the chair, moving with the caution of someone aware that sudden motion might betray weakness. His hands rested loosely on his knees. The tent was quiet except for the distant sounds of the camp beginning its workday. Evelyn studied him again, this time without the distractions of the yard around them. The hollowness in his cheeks, the dryness of his lips, the slight tremor in his fingers as they rested on the fabric of his trousers. These were the small, unmistakable signs of a body running on very little fuel. She walked to the cabinet and poured a glass of water from the metal pitcher resting on top. Then she returned and held it out to him. Keller looked at the glass for a moment before taking it. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said. He drank slowly, carefully, as though each sip needed to last longer than it naturally would. Evelyn watched the way he paused between swallows, stretching the relief as far as possible. It confirmed what she had suspected when she first saw him in the line. This was not just fatigue. This was hunger that had been quietly building for days. Matthias Keller held the glass of water with both hands, as if it were something delicate that might disappear if he was careless. The metal rim touched his lips again, and he took another slow swallow, careful not to drink too quickly. Lieutenant Evelyn Parker had seen that exact rhythm before. Men who had been hungry for too long learned to stretch every small comfort, turning a single glass of water into something that lasted minutes instead of seconds. She stood quietly beside the examination table, giving him time. Outside the canvas walls of the tent, the camp continued its morning routine. Truck engines rumbled to life near the supply shed. Boots moved across gravel. Somewhere a guard called a name from a clipboard. The ordinary sounds of Camp Briarwood rolled through the warm Kansas air like gears in a machine that never truly stopped. Keller finished the water and lowered the glass carefully, as though the act itself required precision. For a moment, he looked at the floor of the tent, gathering his breath. Then he lifted his eyes toward Evelyn again. His expression was composed, almost formal, but the exhaustion in his posture had not disappeared. Evelyn took the empty glass from his hands and set it on the small metal tray beside the cabinet. "You may have another if you need it," she said calmly. Keller nodded once in appreciation, but did not ask for more. His hands returned to his knees, fingers resting loosely against the worn fabric of his trousers. The slight tremor Evelyn had noticed earlier was still there, faint but persistent. She pulled the wooden stool closer and sat across from him, her clipboard resting on her lap. The light filtering through the canvas walls of the tent softened everything inside, turning the bright prairie sunlight into a pale gold glow that filled the space without glare. "How long have you been feeling this way?" she asked. Keller considered the question carefully. A man who had lived through war understood that answers could carry consequences. Finally, he spoke in the same measured English he had used earlier. "It has been gradual, Lieutenant," he said. "Work days are long. Meals are sometimes smaller than the body wishes." He gave a slight smile that held more honesty than complaint. Evelyn wrote a few notes on the clipboard. She did not challenge his phrasing. Prisoners often softened their own circumstances out of habit. Pride traveled easily across languages. She studied him again, this time as a nurse rather than an observer. The color of his skin, the dryness around his mouth, the faint tension in his shoulders. Each sign told a small part of the same story. Hunger rarely announced itself loudly. It crept in quietly through missed calories, long hours of labor, and the stubborn refusal of a person to ask for help. "Did you finish your breakfast yesterday morning?" she asked. Keller looked slightly embarrassed by the question. "I allowed another man to take part of it," he admitted after a moment. He was younger, new to the camp. His stomach had not yet learned patience. The explanation was offered simply, without expectation of praise. Evelyn nodded slowly. That told her even more than the medical signs. Hunger shared between men often meant someone else went without entirely. "You did not replace the meal later," she said. Keller shook his head gently. "There was bread in the evening," he said. "Enough to sleep." The phrase carried a quiet resignation that hung in the air of the tent for a moment. Enough to sleep. Not enough to work a full day beneath the July sun. Evelyn tapped the edge of the clipboard thoughtfully. Outside the tent, she could hear the work trucks pulling closer to the yard where the prisoners would soon be loaded. Engines idled with a low, steady rumble. The wheat fields surrounding Camp Briarwood were nearly ready for harvest. Farmers from 3 nearby counties depended on the prisoners to finish the work before the grain turned too dry in the heat. Every able body in the camp mattered to that schedule, but a body that could not remain upright in the breakfast line was not truly able. Evelyn closed the clipboard and rested it on the examination table. "Mr. Keller," she said quietly, "I want to check a few things before deciding whether you join the work detail today." Keller nodded immediately. "Of course, Lieutenant." His voice carried no resistance, only a calm acceptance of whatever decision might follow. Evelyn stood and moved closer, her manner professional and unhurried. She placed 2 fingers lightly against his wrist to check his pulse. The beat beneath his skin was steady but softer than it should have been. Not dangerous yet, but not strong either. She counted the rhythms silently while the sounds of the camp filtered faintly through the canvas walls. When she finished, she released his wrist and stepped back. Keller watched her carefully, reading her expression with the quiet attention of someone who understood that doctors and nurses often spoke through silence before words. Evelyn reached for a small measuring tape from the cabinet and noted the looseness of his jacket across his shoulders. It confirmed what she had already suspected when she saw him in the line. His weight had dropped during the past few weeks, likely more than anyone had recorded. The camp kitchen served meals according to regulation, but men who shared food or worked beyond their strength sometimes slipped quietly below those calculations. "You are a mechanical technician," she said, glancing at the notes on the clipboard again. "Yes, Lieutenant," Keller replied. "Automobiles before the war." His voice carried the faintest trace of pride when he said it. Machines had been his trade, something steady and understandable. "Do you enjoy the work in the field?" she asked. Keller gave a small, thoughtful shrug. "Wheat does not complain if a man works slowly," he said. "But the sun is stronger here than in Germany." Evelyn allowed herself a brief smile at the understatement. Kansas summers had surprised many soldiers as well. She stepped toward the small shelf beside the cabinet where personal items were sometimes kept during examinations. Her own canvas lunch bag rested there, folded neatly beside a stack of medical charts. She had packed it early that morning before reporting for duty, as she did every day. Bread wrapped in paper, a small apple, nothing elaborate, the ordinary food of a nurse who expected a long shift. She glanced at the bag for only a moment before turning back toward Keller. He sat quietly on the wooden chair, hands folded together now, posture still upright despite the fatigue that pulled at his shoulders. He had not asked for anything more than a glass of water. That fact lingered in Evelyn's thoughts as she walked back toward the examination table. Outside the tent, the rumble of the work trucks grew louder as they rolled closer to the yard. Soon the guards would begin calling names for the morning transport to the fields. Keller would normally be among them. Evelyn studied him one more time, considering the balance between rules and judgment. Camp Briarwood operated on structure. Structure kept order between enemies who had been taught to distrust one another. But sometimes the human body quietly reminded those structures that it required something simpler than regulation. It required food. Keller noticed the direction of her glance toward the shelf where the lunch bag rested. For a moment his eyes followed the movement. Then he looked away quickly, as though he had accidentally stepped into a private space that did not belong to him. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. He had seen the bag, and he had immediately chosen not to acknowledge it. That quiet act of restraint told Evelyn more about the man than any report on her clipboard. She turned back toward him slowly, the morning light still glowing softly through the canvas walls. And in that quiet moment inside the small medical tent, the difference between regulation and compassion began to take shape in her mind. The medical tent remained quiet for several seconds after Evelyn Parker noticed the brief movement of Matthias Keller's eyes toward the shelf. It had been only a fraction of a second, a glance. Then he had turned his gaze away again, as if the act of noticing something that did not belong to him required immediate correction. Evelyn had seen that kind of restraint before. It was the quiet discipline of someone who had spent too long learning how to need nothing. Outside the tent, the morning continued to build momentum. The work trucks were now idling close to the yard gate, their engines vibrating through the ground with a steady mechanical hum. Guards called out names in groups of 10. Prisoners climbed into the open truck beds, boots scraping against metal rails. A Kansas summer morning was beginning the way it always did in farm country, with work waiting in every direction. Inside the tent, the air was warmer now, sunlight spreading through the canvas walls and filling the small space with a pale golden glow. Evelyn folded her arms loosely and leaned against the edge of the examination table for a moment, thinking. Camp regulations were clear about most things. Medical staff could remove a prisoner from labor duty if the prisoner was unfit for work. That rule existed to prevent injury and to keep the camp functioning efficiently. But the regulations did not list hunger as a diagnosis unless it had already reached the point of collapse. Keller had not collapsed. He had only nearly done so. That difference mattered in the language of official reports. Evelyn looked at him again. He sat upright in the wooden chair, shoulders squared out of habit rather than strength. His hands were folded together loosely now, fingers resting quietly against one another as though he were waiting for a decision that did not belong to him. His eyes had returned to the neutral stillness he had carried since the moment she first spoke to him in the breakfast line. A man who expected very little usually learned how to wait. Without asking questions, Evelyn walked toward the shelf again, slowly this time, her boots making soft sounds against the wooden floorboards beneath the canvas. The lunch bag remained exactly where it had been earlier that morning. A simple canvas sack folded once at the top, tied with a short piece of twine. She untied the twine and opened the bag carefully. Inside was the small meal she had packed before dawn. 2 slices of bread wrapped in brown paper. A red apple polished by habit rather than necessity. Nothing extraordinary. Just food meant to carry her through a long shift at the camp medical tent. She held the wrapped bread for a moment without turning around. The paper was still warm from the morning kitchen where she had prepared it before leaving the barracks. Behind her, Keller remained silent. He had not spoken. He had not asked what she was doing. Evelyn finally turned back toward him, the brown paper resting lightly in her hands. "Mr. Keller," she said calmly. Keller lifted his eyes toward her again. "Yes, Lieutenant." His voice was steady but quiet. Evelyn stepped closer and stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the trucks outside drifted through the canvas walls again, followed by the distant laughter of a guard who had just told a joke near the gate. The ordinary rhythm of the camp continued, unaware of the small moment unfolding inside the medical tent. Evelyn held the wrapped bread out toward him. "You need something before you attempt a day in the field," she said. Keller did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at the paper bundle in her hand with a stillness that suggested both understanding and hesitation. His eyes moved from the bread to her face and then back again. "Lieutenant," he said quietly after a moment. "That is your meal." Evelyn nodded once. "That is correct." Keller's hands remained folded together. For a brief second, the faint tremor returned to his fingers, visible in the soft morning light. Regulations inside the camp were simple but firm. Prisoners did not accept personal gifts from staff. Staff did not provide them. Those boundaries were part of the structure Colonel Reed insisted upon to keep the camp orderly. Keller knew those rules. So did Evelyn. "You will need strength for the day," she said calmly. Keller shook his head slightly. "I cannot take your food," he replied. The answer was polite but firm. His voice carried no accusation, only the quiet certainty of someone who had lived long enough under rules to respect them even when they hurt. Evelyn studied him carefully. Pride again. Not the loud kind that demanded recognition. The quiet kind that protected a person's dignity when everything else had been taken away. She unfolded the brown paper slowly and broke 1 slice of bread in half. The soft interior of the loaf caught the light for a moment, pale and simple. She placed 1/2 on the small wooden table beside the examination chair. Then she lifted the other half to her mouth and took a bite. The motion was deliberate and unhurried. She chewed calmly and swallowed before speaking again. "Now it is breakfast," she said. Keller watched her in silence. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he understood what she had done. The bread on the table was no longer a gift offered by a guard to a prisoner. It was simply food placed in front of a man who had not eaten enough to stand upright in the morning line. Keller hesitated for another second. Then he reached forward and picked up the half slice resting on the table. He held it carefully, almost thoughtfully, before taking the first bite. The effect was immediate but subtle. His shoulders lowered a fraction of an inch as his body recognized the presence of real nourishment. He chewed slowly, the way a person chews when every bite carries both relief and disbelief. Evelyn said nothing while he ate. She leaned against the examination table again and watched the quiet change returning to his posture. Outside, the trucks were beginning to roll away from the gate, carrying the first groups of prisoners toward the wheat fields that stretched beyond the horizon. Inside the tent, the moment remained still. Keller finished the bread and wiped his hands lightly against the fabric of his trousers. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said softly. His voice carried the calm gravity of someone who understood the value of what had just happened. Evelyn nodded once. Then she reached for the apple inside the bag and set it beside him on the table. "Eat that as well," she said. Keller looked at the apple and then back at her. "You will have nothing left for your own meal," he said quietly. Evelyn gave a small practical shrug. "The kitchen serves lunch at noon," she replied. "I will manage." Keller studied her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the apple and turned it slowly in his hand, as though confirming that it was real before taking the first bite. The sound of the crisp fruit breaking beneath his teeth filled the quiet tent. And for the first time since Evelyn Parker had seen him standing in the breakfast line that morning, Matthias Keller's breathing began to settle into the steady rhythm of a man whose body had finally received what it needed to continue. Matthias Keller finished the last bite of the apple slowly, carefully chewing as though his body was still learning how to accept food again after days of restraint. The small wooden chair creaked slightly beneath his weight when he shifted forward. The simple meal had not been large, but already it was beginning to change something in his posture. The tightness that had pulled his shoulders inward earlier that morning had eased. His breathing no longer carried the faint, shallow rhythm Evelyn Parker had noticed when he first entered the tent. Outside, the sound of the trucks began to fade across the prairie as the first work crews rolled away toward the wheat fields. Their engines diminished into the wide Kansas morning until only the distant hum remained beneath the quiet of the camp yard. Inside the tent, the light had grown brighter as the sun climbed higher above the horizon. The canvas walls glowed softly, turning the interior air warm and calm. Evelyn folded the empty brown paper and placed it neatly on the table beside the medical charts. She did not treat the moment like an act of generosity. In her mind, it was simply a correction to a problem she had observed. A man who had been expected to stand in line and work an entire day with too little food in his body had now received enough to remain upright. That was all. Keller wiped his hands carefully against his trousers and then rested them again on his knees. For a moment, he looked down at the wooden floorboards beneath the chair as if measuring how much strength had returned to his legs. Then he lifted his eyes toward Evelyn. The difference in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The sharp fatigue that had surrounded his eyes earlier had softened. There was still exhaustion there, but now it shared space with something steadier. A quiet gratitude that did not need to be spoken loudly. "Lieutenant," he said after a moment, his voice calm and respectful. "You have given me more than food this morning." Evelyn shook her head slightly as she moved toward the cabinet to record a note on the clipboard. "I have given you enough to prevent you from falling over in the yard," she replied. Keller allowed himself the faintest smile. Sometimes that is a very large gift. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She finished writing the medical note, marking that Keller had been examined and would remain under observation for the morning rather than joining the labor detail. The decision was practical. A body that had nearly collapsed at breakfast did not belong in a wheat field under the sun for 8 hours. She set the clipboard down and turned back toward him. "You will remain here until midday," she said. "Drink water when you need it. Rest. By afternoon we will see whether you are strong enough to assist with lighter duties near the supply shed." Keller nodded once, accepting the decision without question. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He leaned back slightly in the chair, and for the first time that morning the movement looked natural rather than forced. The nourishment had begun to restore the quiet mechanics of his body. Outside the tent the compound had grown noticeably calmer. Most of the prisoners had already departed for the fields. Only a few guards remained near the gate, their voices drifting faintly across the open yard. A warm breeze moved through the canvas entrance, carrying the smell of dry grass and sunlit earth. Keller looked toward the opening of the tent for a moment, watching the prairie beyond the fence where the wheat stretched in wide golden waves. "In Germany the fields were smaller," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Farms divided by hedges and narrow roads. Here everything feels endless." Evelyn followed his gaze briefly. Kansas had that effect on people who were not used to it. The sky alone could make a person feel very small. "Endless can be peaceful," she said. Keller nodded slowly. "Or lonely." The conversation drifted into silence again for a few minutes. Keller rested quietly while Evelyn organized the medical cabinet and prepared the tent for the rest of the morning. From time to time, she glanced toward him, confirming that his color was slowly returning and that his breathing remained steady. The human body often responded quickly once it received the energy it needed. Around 9 o'clock, the distant sound of another vehicle approached the compound road. Unlike the farm trucks, this engine carried a deeper tone, slower and heavier. Evelyn recognized it immediately. The staff transport from the administrative building. She stepped toward the entrance of the tent and looked across the yard. A dark military sedan rolled through the gate and stopped near the central office building. A guard opened the door and stood at attention. A tall figure stepped out, straightening his uniform jacket as he surveyed the quiet compound. Colonel Thomas Reed had arrived earlier than usual that morning. The camp commander often inspected different sections of the facility during the week, but his visits to the medical tent were normally scheduled in advance. Evelyn watched as he spoke briefly with the guard near the office steps before beginning to walk across the yard. His pace was unhurried but direct, the posture of a man accustomed to observing every part of the system he supervised. Keller noticed the change in Evelyn's attention and turned his head toward the entrance of the tent. He saw the officer approaching across the dusty yard, tall and composed beneath the bright Kansas sky. Even from a distance, the authority carried in Reed's posture was unmistakable. Keller straightened slightly in the chair out of instinct. Camp commanders were not men prisoners encountered casually. Evelyn remained calm. Colonel Reed believed in order, but he also believed in efficiency. Medical evaluations were part of that order. There was no reason for concern. Still, the timing of his arrival felt unexpectedly precise. Reed crossed the yard and stopped briefly near the open entrance of the tent. His gray eyes took in the interior quickly, noting the examination table, the medical charts, and the prisoner seated quietly in the wooden chair. He stepped inside without raising his voice. "Lieutenant Parker," he said evenly. "Good morning." Evelyn stood at attention for a moment before relaxing again. "Good morning, Colonel." Reed nodded once and glanced toward Keller. The prisoner met his gaze respectfully, but without fear. Reed had built a reputation within the camp for treating discipline and fairness as two parts of the same structure. He believed prisoners were still men, and men functioned best under clear rules. Reed stepped farther into the tent, his boots sounding softly against the floorboards. "I did not expect to see one of the field laborers here during the morning shift," he said calmly. Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Mr. Keller was removed from the breakfast line for medical observation, Colonel." Reed studied Keller for a brief moment, noticing the looseness of the uniform jacket and the quiet fatigue that had not yet fully disappeared from his posture. Then his eyes moved to the small wooden table beside the chair where the folded brown paper from Evelyn's lunch still rested. He did not comment immediately. Instead, he turned back toward Evelyn with the same composed expression he carried through every inspection. "Is the prisoner able to work later today?" he asked. Evelyn answered clearly. "After rest and water, I believe he will be able to assist with light duties this afternoon." Reed nodded once more. His gaze returned briefly to Keller and then again to the table beside him. For a moment, the quiet inside the tent seemed to stretch slightly longer than necessary, as though the commander had noticed something small but significant in the scene before him. The folded brown paper. The relaxed posture of a prisoner who had arrived that morning barely able to stand. Reed did not speak immediately. Instead, he remained still for a moment, observing the room with the calm patience of a man who had learned that the smallest details often revealed the most important truths. Colonel Thomas Reed remained still inside the medical tent for several seconds, his eyes moving slowly across the small details of the room. Years of command had trained him to read environments the same way other men read documents. Nothing in the tent was out of place. The examination table stood neatly against the wall. The medical charts were stacked in precise order. The canvas sides of the tent moved gently with the breeze drifting in from the prairie. And yet something about the quiet arrangement of objects told him that the morning had unfolded differently than usual. His gaze rested for a moment on the folded brown paper lying on the small wooden table beside Matthias Keller's chair. The paper had been flattened carefully, not discarded or crumpled. That detail alone suggested it had held something recently. Reed's eyes lifted toward Lieutenant Evelyn Parker again. She stood calmly near the examination table, her posture relaxed but attentive, hands resting loosely at her sides. There was no nervousness in her expression, no attempt to explain anything before a question had been asked. That steadiness was something Reed respected in officers under his command. Behind him, the warm Kansas sunlight spilled through the open entrance of the tent, bright enough to outline his tall frame against the canvas walls. Outside, the compound had grown quiet after the departure of the morning work trucks. The distant prairie wind moved through the grass beyond the fences, carrying the soft whisper of summer across the camp. Reed stepped forward once, slowly, his boots making a measured sound against the wooden floorboards. His attention moved from the folded paper to the man seated in the chair. Matthias Keller had straightened when the commander entered, instinct guiding him to show respect without being told. Now he sat upright again, hands resting quietly on his knees. The color had begun to return faintly to his face, and his breathing no longer carried the shallow rhythm Reed had sometimes seen in exhausted prisoners returning from the fields. Keller met the commander's eyes with calm discipline, neither defiant nor submissive. Just steady. Reed turned slightly toward Evelyn. Lieutenant Parker, he said in the same, even tone he used for every official conversation. You mentioned the prisoner was removed from the breakfast line for medical observation. Yes, Colonel, Evelyn replied. Reed glanced once more at Keller. Was the condition severe? Evelyn shook her head gently. Not severe, Colonel. But he was close to collapsing when I observed him in the yard. Reed absorbed the information silently. His gaze returned to the folded brown paper on the table again, then back to Evelyn. And now he appears considerably stronger, he said quietly. Evelyn answered without hesitation. Yes, Colonel. Reed took another slow step across the tent, stopping beside the small wooden table. From this angle the paper was even more obvious. A faint scent of fresh bread still lingered in the air, subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years around military kitchens and field rations. Reed did not touch the paper. He simply looked at it for a moment before speaking again. Lieutenant Parker, he said calmly. Did the prisoner receive food in this tent? Evelyn did not attempt to avoid the question. Yes, Colonel, she said plainly. Reed's eyes lifted to hers again. From your personal meal? Yes, Colonel. The words hung quietly in the warm air of the tent. Reed did not react immediately. Outside, a guard's voice drifted faintly across the compound as he called instructions to a small maintenance crew near the supply shed. The ordinary sounds of the camp continued, indifferent to the quiet conversation inside the medical tent. Reed looked again toward Keller, studying the young man's posture and the faint signs of strength returning to his frame. The commander had spent enough years around soldiers and prisoners alike to recognize the difference between a man who had eaten and a man who had not. Keller did not lower his eyes or attempt to hide the truth. He simply sat with the composed stillness of someone who understood that honesty required no performance. Reed clasped his hands behind his back, a habit that often appeared when he was thinking carefully before speaking. Lieutenant Parker, he said after a moment. Are you aware of the regulation concerning personal provisions given to prisoners? Yes, Colonel, Evelyn replied. Reed's expression did not change. And yet you made the decision to share your meal. Evelyn nodded once. Yes, Colonel. Reed's voice remained steady. Explain your reasoning. Evelyn answered the way she always answered medical questions. Directly. When I observed Mr. Keller in the breakfast line, he was unable to remain steady on his feet, she said. His pulse indicated fatigue consistent with inadequate nourishment. Sending him to the fields in that condition would have risked collapse during labor duty. Reed listened without interrupting. Evelyn continued calmly. I could have ordered him confined to the medical tent without food until the noon meal. But that would not have addressed the immediate problem. Reed studied her face for a moment longer. You believed immediate nourishment was medically necessary. Yes, Colonel. Reed turned his head slightly toward Keller again. Mr. Keller, he said. Keller responded immediately. Yes, Colonel. Reed's voice carried the same quiet authority it always did when addressing prisoners. Did Lieutenant Parker offer you food? Yes, Colonel, Keller replied. And did you request it? No, Colonel. Reed watched him for another moment. Why not? Keller answered honestly. Because it was not mine to request. Reed's gaze remained fixed on him for a second longer before shifting back toward Evelyn. The tent grew quiet again, filled only with the soft movement of the prairie wind against the canvas walls. For several seconds Reed said nothing. The silence was not tense. It was thoughtful. He looked once more at the folded brown paper, then toward Keller's steadier posture, and finally back at Evelyn. Lieutenant Parker, he said slowly. Camp Briarwood operates under clear rules for a reason. Yes, Colonel, she replied. Discipline and fairness, Reed continued. They prevent resentment between guards and prisoners. They ensure the system remains stable. Evelyn nodded. I understand, Colonel. Reed studied her expression carefully. Do you believe your action violated that stability? Evelyn answered calmly. No, Colonel. I believe it prevented a preventable medical incident. Reed remained silent again for a moment. Then something subtle changed in his expression. Not approval exactly. Not disapproval either. Just a small shift in thought. He walked toward the entrance of the tent, and looked out across the compound where the prairie stretched wide and bright under the rising sun. The wheat fields beyond the fences shimmered in the distance, waiting for the workers who had already departed that morning. Reed spoke without turning around. "Lieutenant Parker." "Yes, Colonel." "If Mr. Keller had collapsed in the field today, it would have disrupted the work crew and required transport back to this tent." "Yes, Colonel." Reed nodded faintly. "Efficiency matters in a place like this." "Yes, Colonel." Reed finally turned back toward them both. His gray eyes moved once more between the quiet nurse who had chosen to act and the prisoner who had quietly accepted help without asking. For a brief moment the commander said nothing at all, and in that stillness the small decision made inside the medical tent that morning seemed to settle into the structure of the camp like a quiet truth that did not require further argument. Colonel Thomas Reed stood near the entrance of the medical tent for a moment longer, the sunlight from the Kansas morning outlining his figure against the canvas walls. His expression remained calm, but something behind his gray eyes had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that the quiet logic of the morning had settled into his mind. He turned back toward Lieutenant Evelyn Parker and Matthias Keller, clasping his hands behind his back again in the familiar posture of command. The silence in the tent lasted another second before Reed spoke. "Lieutenant Parker," he said in the same even tone that had guided the camp since its opening. "The purpose of regulations is to preserve order." "Yes, Colonel," Evelyn replied. Reed nodded once. "But the purpose of order is to preserve function." Evelyn said nothing. She understood the distinction immediately. Reed turned his gaze toward Keller again, studying the young man's posture carefully. The prisoner sat upright in the wooden chair, shoulders squared, breathing steady. The difference between the man Reed saw now and the man who must have stood in the breakfast line earlier was visible even to an untrained eye. Reed had commanded soldiers long enough to recognize the signs of recovery. Strength returning slowly to a body that had been near its limit. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet in front of Keller. "Mr. Keller," he said calmly. "Yes," Colonel Keller answered. Reed's voice remained neutral, neither harsh nor overly kind. "You were scheduled for field labor this morning." "Yes, Colonel." "And in your condition, you would not have lasted the full shift." Keller hesitated only slightly before answering. "That is correct, Colonel." Reed studied him for another moment. "Did you inform anyone of your condition before Lieutenant Parker removed you from the line?" "No, Colonel," Keller replied quietly. Reed tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" Keller answered with the same straightforward honesty he had shown earlier. "Because I believed I could remain standing, Colonel." Reed allowed the faintest hint of acknowledgement in his eyes. A soldier's answer. Pride measured against endurance. The commander turned slightly toward Evelyn again. "Lieutenant Parker," he said, "your assessment appears to have been correct." "Thank you, Colonel," she replied. Reed glanced once more toward the folded brown paper on the table and then back to Keller. "Mr. Keller," he continued, "Camp Briarwood depends on discipline from both staff and prisoners. That discipline includes honesty about physical limits." Keller nodded. "Yes, Colonel." Reed's tone remained steady. "If a prisoner collapses in the field, the entire work crew must stop. A truck must return. A medic must respond. It wastes time for everyone involved." "Yes, Colonel," Keller said again. Reed held his gaze for another moment before speaking the next words. "Next time you report fatigue before the line reaches that point. Do you understand?" Keller answered immediately. "Yes, Colonel." Reed nodded once more. "Good." The commander turned away from the chair and walked slowly toward the examination table, glancing briefly at the medical charts stacked neatly beside Evelyn's clipboard. The quiet of the tent continued to hold its steady calm. Outside, the prairie wind moved softly across the compound, stirring dust along the empty yard where the work crews had stood earlier that morning. Reed stopped beside the table and spoke without looking directly at Evelyn. "Lieutenant Parker." "Yes, Colonel." "Record Mr. Keller for light duty this afternoon near the supply shed." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, Colonel." Reed continued. "Ensure he receives the standard noon meal before beginning any labor." "Of course, Colonel." Reed paused again, then finally turned toward them both. His expression had returned fully to the composed neutrality that defined his command style. There was no lecture, no reprimand, only the quiet continuation of order. Keller remained seated, hands resting calmly on his knees. For a brief moment his eyes met Evelyn's. The look carried a silent understanding. The morning had turned in a direction neither of them had expected when the breakfast line first formed in the yard. Reed walked toward the entrance of the tent again and paused just before stepping outside. "Lieutenant Parker," he said without turning around. "Yes, Colonel. Next time you believe a prisoner requires immediate nourishment for medical reasons, you will report it in your logbook." Evelyn answered calmly. "Yes, Colonel." Reed nodded faintly. "Documentation preserves clarity." "Understood, Colonel." Reed stepped out into the bright sunlight of the compound. His boots crunched softly on the dusty ground as he crossed the yard toward the administrative building where his sedan waited. A guard straightened near the office steps when he approached. Inside the medical tent, the air felt slightly lighter once the commander's presence had moved away. Keller exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath he had been holding since Reed first appeared at the entrance. Evelyn walked back toward the cabinet and poured another glass of water. She handed it to him without ceremony. "Drink," she said simply. Keller accepted the glass and took a steady sip. "Thank you, Lieutenant." After a moment he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Your commander is a careful man." Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. "Yes, he is." Keller nodded slowly. "In my country, officers sometimes spoke loudly to prove authority. Reed does not need to." Evelyn leaned lightly against the examination table again. "Colonel Reed believes calm decisions last longer than loud ones." Keller considered that statement for a moment. Then he looked toward the open entrance of the tent where the bright prairie stretched beyond the compound fence. The wheat fields shimmered under the rising sun, waiting for the labor crews already working among the tall golden stalks. After another quiet moment, Keller spoke again. "Lieutenant Parker." "Yes, Mr. Keller. I will remember this morning." Evelyn folded the brown paper neatly and placed it inside the empty lunch bag before tying the twine again. "There is nothing to remember," she said lightly. Keller shook his head gently. "There is always something to remember when a person chooses kindness over rules." Evelyn met his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back toward the medical charts on the table. "Sometimes rules exist to support kindness," she replied. Keller did not answer immediately. Instead, he finished the glass of water and placed it carefully on the table beside him. Outside, the prairie wind continued to move across the wide Kansas fields, carrying the quiet sound of summer through the camp as the morning slowly unfolded into the long working hours ahead. The medical tent settled into a quieter rhythm after Colonel Reed crossed the compound and disappeared into the administrative building. The sound of his boots faded into the distance, replaced once again by the soft, ordinary noises of Camp Briarwood. A breeze drifted through the open entrance of the tent, carrying the dry scent of Kansas wheat fields warming beneath the late morning sun. Lieutenant Evelyn Parker stood near the examination table for a moment, reviewing the notes she had written on the medical clipboard. Her handwriting was steady and precise, the kind that made reports easy to read weeks later when memory alone might not be enough. She wrote a short entry beside the name Matthias Keller. Removed from breakfast line due to physical instability. Observed for fatigue associated with inadequate nourishment. Light duty recommended afternoon meal. The words were simple and clinical. Anyone reading them would see a routine medical observation. They would not see the quiet moment inside the tent when a half slice of bread and a single apple had changed the direction of a man's morning. Evelyn closed the clipboard and placed it carefully back on the table. Across from her, Keller sat quietly in the wooden chair, watching the light shift slowly across the canvas wall as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The warmth inside the tent had grown comfortable now, not the harsh heat that would arrive in the afternoon, but the steady warmth of a prairie morning that seemed to stretch forever across the horizon. Keller placed both feet firmly on the floor and leaned forward slightly, testing the strength returning to his legs. The difference was noticeable even in small movements. Earlier that morning, every motion had required careful balance. Now his body responded more naturally. He inhaled slowly and exhaled through his nose, feeling the steady rhythm of breath that had been difficult only an hour before. Food, even in small amounts, had begun restoring the quiet machinery of his body. Evelyn noticed the change. "That is better," she said calmly. Keller nodded once. "Yes, Lieutenant." His voice sounded stronger now, not loud, but steady. "It is remarkable how quickly the body remembers its purpose when it is given what it needs." Evelyn leaned lightly against the table again. "The human body is very patient," she said, "but it does not negotiate forever. Keller allowed a faint smile. That is true. For several minutes the tent remained quiet. Outside a pair of guards walked past the entrance on their routine inspection route, their conversation drifting briefly through the canvas opening before fading again. Somewhere near the supply shed a hammer struck wood in a slow, rhythmic pattern as maintenance workers repaired a fence rail damaged by last week's storm. The ordinary work of the camp continued in every direction. Keller eventually spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than heavy. Lieutenant Parker. Yes, Mr. Keller. You said earlier that you believe rules can support kindness. Evelyn nodded slightly. Sometimes they do. Keller considered the statement carefully. In the place where I grew up, rules were often used to separate people rather than protect them. Evelyn glanced toward the open prairie for a moment. War has a way of twisting the purpose of rules, she said quietly. Keller rested his hands loosely on his knees again. Before the war, I worked in a small repair garage outside Hamburg, he said. Automobiles mostly. Trucks when they came through the city. Machines were simpler than politics. If something broke, you replaced the part, and the machine worked again. Evelyn listened without interrupting. The calm way he spoke suggested he had not told many people these things during his time in the camp. Keller continued. When the war expanded, many of the young men left the city. Mechanics were needed elsewhere. I was sent to repair transport vehicles near the eastern border. He paused briefly, choosing his words carefully. Eventually the war ended for me when American forces reached the area where I was working. Evelyn nodded slowly. Many prisoners in Briarwood had arrived through similar stories. War moved men across continents until they found themselves standing behind fences thousands of miles from home. Keller looked down at his hands for a moment before continuing. I have been in this camp for 7 months now, he said. Most days are the same. Work in the fields. Evening meal. Sleep. Then the next morning begins again. He looked up again, meeting Evelyn's eyes calmly. This morning was different. Evelyn gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Because you nearly fell over in the breakfast line. Keller shook his head gently. Because someone noticed before that happened. The statement hung quietly between them for a moment. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She walked to the cabinet and poured another glass of water, placing it beside Keller on the small table without comment. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the compound again, rustling the tall grass beyond the fences. Keller lifted the glass and drank slowly. When he finished, he looked toward the entrance of the tent where the sky stretched wide and clear above the golden fields. In Germany, the sky rarely feels this large, he said quietly. Evelyn followed his gaze. Kansas has a way of reminding people how small they are, she said. Keller nodded once. And sometimes how small our divisions are as well. Evelyn returned to the examination table and opened the medical kit to check the supplies for the afternoon shift. Bandages, antiseptic bottles, thermometer cases. Everything in its proper place. The careful routine helped keep the tent organized during long days when injuries from the fields occasionally arrived without warning. Keller watched her work in silence for a moment. Then he stood slowly from the chair. The movement was steady now, no longer, carrying the faint uncertainty that had marked his posture earlier that morning. He took a step forward and paused, testing his balance. The strength had returned enough to move naturally again. Evelyn looked up from the cabinet. Better, she said. Keller nodded. Much better, Lieutenant. She gestured toward the chair again. Sit until noon, she said calmly. There is no prize for standing longer than necessary. Keller obeyed without protest, lowering himself back into the chair with a quiet nod. Yes, Lieutenant. Outside the camp, the endless wheat fields shimmered under the growing sun, while the labor crews worked steadily among the tall golden rows. Inside the medical tent, the quiet moment between a nurse and a prisoner settled gently into the rhythm of the day, becoming one more small story carried by the wide Kansas wind across the prairie. Late morning settled slowly across Camp Briarwood, stretching the shadows of the barracks across the dusty yard, while the Kansas sun climbed higher above the prairie. Inside the medical tent, the air had grown warmer, though the steady breeze drifting through the canvas entrance kept the space comfortable. Lieutenant Evelyn Parker finished arranging the medical supplies inside the cabinet and closed the door with a soft click. The quiet order of the room matched the calm pace of the morning. Across from her, Matthias Keller remained seated in the wooden chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. The difference between the man who had arrived earlier that morning and the man sitting there now was unmistakable. His shoulders rested naturally instead of tightening against fatigue, and the faint color returning to his face suggested that the small meal had done exactly what the body needed it to do. Outside the tent, the compound carried on with its usual rhythm. A small group of maintenance workers crossed the yard toward the storage shed carrying tools over their shoulders. Their boots scraped lightly against the gravel as they walked. A guard leaned against the gate post while checking the time on his wristwatch, waiting for the noon hour when the field crews would return for their midday break. The prairie wind moved steadily across the open land beyond the fence, bending the tall wheat in slow golden waves that stretched toward the distant horizon. Keller watched the movement of the fields for a moment before speaking again. "Lieutenant Parker." "Yes, Mr. Keller." "When the trucks return at noon, the other prisoners will notice that I remained behind this morning." Evelyn looked up from the chart she had been reviewing. "That is correct," she said calmly. Keller nodded slowly. "Some of them will ask questions." Evelyn leaned lightly against the examination table. "And what will you tell them?" Keller thought about the question for a moment. "The truth," he said simply. "That I needed rest, and the medical officer required observation." Evelyn studied his expression for a second. "That is accurate," she said. Keller allowed himself a faint smile. Accuracy and truth are sometimes slightly different things. Evelyn returned the small smile before turning back to the chart. "In this case, they are close enough." Keller rested his hands on his knees again, fingers loosely interlocked. The quiet inside the tent seemed comfortable now, no longer filled with the tension that had accompanied Colonel Reed's unexpected arrival earlier in the morning. Keller spoke again after a moment, his voice thoughtful rather than heavy. "Lieutenant Parker." "Yes, Mr. Keller." "I was surprised that your commander did not reprimand you." Evelyn considered the remark while closing the chart folder. "Colonel Reed believes discipline is strongest when it does not require unnecessary demonstrations," she said. Keller nodded slowly. "In my experience, many commanders prefer the opposite." Evelyn walked to the entrance of the tent and looked out across the compound for a moment. Reed's sedan still stood near the administrative building where he had returned to his office after leaving the medical tent earlier. A pair of clerks crossed the steps carrying folders while a guard stood nearby with quiet attention. Reed had already moved on to the next task of his day. The small moment inside the tent likely filed away among dozens of other decisions he would make before evening. Evelyn turned back toward Keller. "Colonel Reed has commanded this camp since it opened," she said. "He believes consistency is more effective than noise." Keller tilted his head slightly. "That is unusual in wartime." Evelyn shrugged lightly. "Perhaps that is why the camp remains quiet." Keller accepted the explanation with a small nod. "Silence can be a form of order," he said. A few minutes passed while the breeze moved through the tent again, carrying with it the distant smell of sun-warmed wheat. Keller shifted slightly in the chair and then stood once more, testing his balance again. This time the movement was completely steady. He walked 2 slow steps across the tent and then back toward the chair again. Evelyn observed him with a practiced eye. "Good," she said simply. Keller sat again and exhaled slowly. "I believe I will be ready for light work this afternoon." "That is the plan," Evelyn replied. "The noon meal will help as well." Keller nodded. "The men working in the fields will return soon." Evelyn glanced at the small clock mounted beside the cabinet. It was approaching 11:30. In another 30 minutes the trucks would begin appearing at the gate again, carrying the labor crews back from the fields. The camp kitchen would open the serving line once more, and the prisoners would move through the compound in orderly groups, trays in their hands and dust from the prairie fields on their boots. Keller followed her glance toward the clock. "Time moves differently in a place like this," he said quietly. Evelyn looked at him with curiosity. "How so?" Keller folded his hands together again. "When I first arrived the days felt endless," he said. "Every hour seemed heavier than the one before it. But eventually the routine begins to shape the time. Morning line, field work, evening meal, sleep. The same pattern again the next day." Evelyn nodded. "Structure has that effect." Keller looked toward the open prairie again, where the wheat fields shimmered beneath the bright sun. "But sometimes one moment changes the way a day is remembered," he added softly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped outside the tent for a moment and scanned the horizon where the dirt road curved toward the distant fields. In the far distance, a faint cloud of dust had begun to rise along the road. The field crews were returning earlier than expected, their trucks moving slowly back toward the compound for the midday break. She stepped back inside the tent. "The trucks will be here soon," she said. Keller nodded calmly. Then I should prepare to return to the yard. Evelyn lifted the clipboard from the table again and handed it to him briefly so he could see the entry she had written beside his name. You will report to the supply shed after lunch, she said. Light duty only. Keller read the note carefully before handing the clipboard back. Thank you, Lieutenant. Outside, the distant rumble of engines grew louder as the trucks approached the camp gate, carrying the men who had spent the morning working beneath the wide Kansas sky. Inside the medical tent, the quiet understanding between the nurse and the prisoner settled into the warm air like a small, unspoken agreement that the day, despite its routine, had taken a path neither of them would forget. The distant rumble of engines grew steadily louder as the trucks carrying the field crews approached the camp gate. Dust rose along the road beyond the fence, drifting slowly upward into the bright Kansas sky. Inside the medical tent, Matthias Keller stood from the wooden chair once more, this time without hesitation. The strength in his legs felt real now, not borrowed or temporary. Lieutenant Evelyn Parker watched him carefully for a moment before nodding once in quiet approval. That will do, she said. Keller straightened his uniform jacket out of habit, smoothing the worn fabric across his shoulders. The movement was small but deliberate, the way a man prepared himself before stepping back into the structure of the camp. Outside, the first truck rolled through the gate and slowed near the yard, its tires crunching against the gravel as it came to a stop. The men in the truck bed climbed down one by one, boots dusty and shirts damp from the morning's labor beneath the prairie sun. Their voices carried across the compound as they formed a loose line toward the mess hall where the noon meal would soon begin. Keller looked toward the entrance of the tent and listened quietly for a moment. The familiar sounds of the returning crews filled the air. The scrape of boots, the low murmur of conversation in several languages, the clang of the kitchen door opening as the cooks prepared the serving tables. The ordinary rhythm of midday at Camp Briarwood had arrived. Evelyn stepped toward the small table and picked up the clipboard again, glancing briefly at the entry beside Keller's name. Then she set it back down and folded her arms loosely. The noon meal will begin in a few minutes, she said. You should return to the yard with the others. Keller nodded once. Yes, Lieutenant. He paused for a moment before speaking again. I will report to the supply shed afterward as instructed. That is correct, Evelyn replied. The work. There is lighter, mostly organizing equipment and loading small crates. Keller allowed a faint smile. Machines again, in a way. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. That may make the afternoon easier. Keller took one step toward the entrance of the tent and then stopped. For a brief moment, he looked back at the wooden chair where he had been sitting earlier that morning. The chair looked ordinary now, no different from any other piece of furniture inside the medical tent. And yet he knew that when he had first lowered himself into it, his body had been very close to surrendering to exhaustion. A single morning could carry many quiet turning points. Keller turned back toward Evelyn. Lieutenant Parker, he said calmly. Yes, Mr. Keller. I understand that the rules of this camp require distance between prisoners and staff. Evelyn nodded. That is true. Keller spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. Even so, I would like you to know that I will remember the help you gave today. Evelyn considered the statement for a moment before answering. Then remember it as a medical decision, she said. Keller smiled slightly. Sometimes the difference between medicine and kindness is very small. Evelyn allowed herself the briefest hint of amusement. Perhaps, she said. Keller gave a respectful nod and stepped out of the tent into the bright sunlight of the compound. The prairie air felt warmer now, the sun high above the fields beyond the fence. He walked steadily across the dusty yard toward the growing line of prisoners gathering outside the mess hall. A few of the men noticed him approaching and glanced in his direction with mild curiosity. Most of them had boarded the trucks earlier that morning expecting Keller to be among them. Now he appeared from the direction of the medical tent instead. One of the prisoners near the end of the line, a tall man named Otto Reinhardt, raised an eyebrow when Keller reached his place beside him. Otto spoke quietly in German. Medical tent this morning. Keller nodded once. Observation, Otto said. Keller kept his answer simple. Yes. Otto studied him for a moment before nodding in understanding. The line moved forward slowly as the kitchen workers began passing out trays. The smell of warm bread and soup drifted through the open windows of the mess hall. Keller stood calmly with the others, the faint fatigue of the morning now replaced by steady energy. When his turn came, he stepped inside the building and accepted the tray offered by the cook. The meal was simple but generous enough to satisfy a man who had worked in the fields all morning. Keller carried the tray to a wooden table near the window and sat with Otto and two other prisoners who had returned from the trucks. The men spoke quietly while eating, their conversation drifting between memories of home and speculation about how long the war's aftermath might continue. Keller ate steadily, grateful for the warmth of the meal and the quiet restoration it brought to his body. Outside the mess hall windows, the Kansas sky stretched wide and clear above the endless wheat fields. After the meal, Keller returned his tray to the kitchen window and stepped back into the sunlight of the yard. The afternoon work assignments were already being posted on a board near the supply shed. Guards directed small groups of prisoners toward different tasks around the compound. Keller walked toward the shed and presented himself to the corporal supervising the area. The corporal glanced at the clipboard in his hand and nodded toward a stack of wooden crates near the open door. Keller, light duty, inventory and sorting equipment. Keller nodded once and stepped inside the shed where the shade offered relief from the bright afternoon sun. The interior smelled faintly of wood and machine oil. Tools hung neatly on the walls while crates of spare parts were stacked along the back. Keller began organizing the equipment exactly as instructed, moving carefully but efficiently as the hours of the afternoon unfolded. Occasionally he glanced toward the yard where the medical tent stood quietly at the edge of the compound. From a distance, it looked small against the vast prairie beyond the fence. Just another canvas structure among many buildings that kept the camp functioning. Yet Keller knew that inside that tent earlier that morning a small moment had shifted the course of an ordinary day. As the afternoon sun moved slowly westward across the Kansas sky, Camp Briarwood continued its steady rhythm of work and quiet order. And somewhere within that rhythm, a simple act of attention had reminded two people from opposite sides of a war that even inside a prison camp the smallest gestures could carry more weight than rules. Alone, the afternoon sun moved slowly across the wide Kansas sky, stretching long bands of light across the dusty yard of Camp Briarwood. Inside the supply shed, Matthias Keller worked steadily among the rows of wooden crates, sorting metal tools and small mechanical parts into their proper places. The work was simple but precise. Wrenches in one box, bolts and fasteners in another. Replacement hinges stacked neatly along the shelf near the back wall. For a man who had once spent his days repairing engines and transmission systems, the quiet organization of tools felt familiar. Machines had always been easier to understand than war. The shade inside the shed offered relief from the growing heat outside, though the warm prairie air still drifted through the open doorway carrying the smell of sunlit wheat fields. Keller moved carefully but without strain, lifting each crate with a steady motion that confirmed his strength had returned after the long morning. Every so often he paused to wipe the dust from a tool handle or to check the markings on a crate lid before placing it on the correct shelf. The corporal supervising the shed glanced over occasionally from his position near the door. Keller's pace was not fast, but it was reliable, and reliability was valued inside a place that depended on order to function smoothly. Beyond the open doorway, the compound moved through its quiet afternoon routine. A pair of guards walked the perimeter fence while a truck delivered fresh water barrels to the field crews still working in the distant rows of wheat. Somewhere near the maintenance shed, a hammer tapped steadily against wood as repairs continued on the damaged fence rail. The camp lived in small practical motions like these, each task fitting into the next until the entire system moved forward without noise or confusion. Keller set another crate of tools onto a shelf and stepped back for a moment to stretch his shoulders. Through the open doorway, he could see the canvas roof of the medical tent standing near the far edge of the yard. From this distance, it looked almost fragile against the vast landscape beyond the fence, a pale shape beneath the enormous sky. He wondered briefly what Lieutenant Evelyn Parker was doing at that moment. Most afternoons the medical tent remained quiet unless one of the field crews returned with heat exhaustion or a strained muscle from lifting grain sacks. The thought passed through his mind the way many thoughts did during long hours of routine work. Quiet and brief. Keller turned back to the crates and continued sorting the equipment. The steady repetition of the task carried him through the next hour without interruption. By mid-afternoon the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western edge of the prairie. The light entering the supply shed shifted from bright white to a warmer shade of gold, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The corporal near the doorway checked the pocket watch clipped to his belt and called out a short instruction to the workers inside. 15 minutes until the evening line. Keller nodded in acknowledgement and placed the final set of wrenches neatly into their crate. When he finished, he brushed the dust from his hands and stepped outside into the open yard. The air felt cooler now as the long Kansas afternoon began leaning toward evening. Across the compound, prisoners from the wheat fields were already returning in small groups, their clothes dusty and their movements slower after a full day of labor under the sun. Some of them paused near the water barrels to rinse their hands, while others walked directly toward the barracks to prepare for the evening meal. Keller joined the slow movement of men heading across the yard. Otto Reinhardt spotted him again near the edge of the path and fell into step beside him. Otto glanced toward the supply shed behind them. "Light duty suits you," he said quietly in German. Keller allowed a faint smile. "It suits my legs today." Otto studied him for a moment. "You look stronger than this morning." Keller nodded. "I am." Otto did not ask further questions. In places like Briarwood, men learned that some details did not need explanation. They continued walking together toward the barracks while the warm evening wind moved across the prairie grass beyond the fences. Near the far side of the compound, the canvas roof of the medical tent caught the golden light of the setting sun. Keller glanced toward it again as he passed. The tent stood quiet, its entrance flap moving gently in the breeze. For a brief moment, he imagined the morning inside that small space. The wooden chair, the glass of water, the simple brown paper holding half a loaf of bread. Small things that had shifted the balance of an ordinary day. The men reached the barracks and stepped inside to wash the dust from their hands before the dinner line formed. The interior smelled faintly of soap and wood, familiar scents that marked the end of a long workday. Keller splashed cool water over his face at the basin near the door and dried his hands on the rough cloth towel hanging nearby. The fatigue in his muscles felt honest now, the kind that came from work rather than weakness. When he stepped back outside, the evening line was already forming near the mess hall. The sky above the prairie had begun to soften into shades of orange and pale violet as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Keller took his place among the others and waited quietly while the cooks opened the kitchen doors. The men around him spoke in low voices, trading small observations about the day's work in the fields or the weather that would shape tomorrow's harvest. Keller listened without adding much. His thoughts drifted occasionally back to the events of the morning. Not with drama, just with quiet recognition that something simple had carried unexpected weight. When the line moved forward, he accepted the tray offered through the kitchen window and carried it to a table near the far wall. Otto joined him again along with two other prisoners from the field crew. They ate slowly while the last light of the day filtered through the windows of the mess hall. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath the fading sky, the wheat fields glowing softly in the last rays of the sun. After the meal, Keller returned his tray and stepped back into the cooling air of the compound. Evening had settled gently over Camp Briarwood, the wide Kansas horizon turning deep blue as the first stars appeared above the quiet fields. And somewhere beyond the rows of barracks, the small canvas medical tent stood silent beneath the enormous sky, holding within it the memory of a morning that had quietly reminded two people that even in a place built on rules and fences, the smallest act of attention could still carry the weight of something deeply human. Evening settled slowly across Camp Briarwood after the dinner trays had been returned and the last voices inside the mess hall faded into the quiet rhythm of the barracks. The sky above the Kansas prairie deepened into a wide field of dark blue while the final streaks of orange sunlight disappeared beyond the distant wheat fields. The wind that crossed the open land had grown cooler, moving gently through the fences and wooden buildings of the camp, as if the vast plains themselves were exhaling after the long heat of the day. Inside the prisoner barracks, Matthias Keller sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, loosening the laces of his work boots while the other men moved quietly around the room preparing for the night. The barracks held the familiar sounds of evening routine. Water splashing into metal basins. Boots set carefully beside bed frames. Low conversations spoken in German or English as the men compared the small details of their day in the fields. Keller removed his boots and set them beneath the bed before leaning back against the wooden wall behind the bunk. The fatigue in his muscles felt steady and honest, the kind that came from a day of useful work rather than from hunger or weakness. Otto Reinhardt sat across the aisle cleaning dust from the sleeves of his work shirt while humming softly to himself. After a moment, Otto glanced toward Keller again. "You moved crates all afternoon," he said quietly. Keller nodded. "Tools mostly." It was calm work. Otto shrugged slightly. "Better than lifting wheat sacks in the sun." Keller allowed a faint smile. "Today I agree." The barracks grew quieter as the men settled into their bunks one by one. Outside the building, the guards made their evening rounds along the perimeter fence, their footsteps steady against the gravel paths that circled the compound. The lights mounted on tall wooden poles flickered on gradually, casting soft yellow circles across the yard. Keller rested his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling beams for a moment. The long prairie wind whispered against the walls of the barracks, carrying the distant sound of insects rising from the fields beyond the fence. The events of the morning returned to his mind again, not with urgency, but with quiet clarity. A wooden chair in the medical tent. A glass of water. The sound of brown paper unfolding in careful hands. Moments that had lasted only minutes, yet somehow remained vivid in memory long after the day had continued forward. Keller turned his head toward the small window beside his bunk. Through the glass, he could see the pale outline of the medical tent standing across the compound, its canvas walls glowing faintly beneath the electric lights. Somewhere inside that small structure, Lieutenant Evelyn Parker was likely finishing her evening records, writing notes in the same careful handwriting he had seen earlier that morning. The thought brought a quiet sense of balance to his mind. In a place defined by fences and schedules, the presence of one person willing to notice another human being carried more meaning than most men expected to find. Across the compound inside the medical tent, Evelyn Parker indeed sat at the narrow wooden desk near the back wall, reviewing the final entries in the daily medical logbook. The lantern beside her cast a warm circle of light across the pages while the rest of the tent remained softly shadowed. She turned each page carefully, confirming the names and notes recorded throughout the day. 2 minor heat exhaustion cases from the field crew. 1 blistered hand from a farm tool accident. And the morning entry for Matthias Keller, written in the same precise lines she used for every patient. Removed from breakfast line due to fatigue. Observed and stabilized. Light duty recommended. The words looked clinical and routine, exactly as they should in an official record. Yet Evelyn knew that the quiet space between those lines carried something no report could capture. She closed the logbook gently and set the pen beside it before leaning back in the chair for a moment. The long day had passed more quickly than she expected. Outside, the prairie night had fully arrived, stretching across the fields in deep stillness broken only by the distant sound of insects and the occasional call of a night bird somewhere beyond the fence line. Evelyn stood and stepped toward the entrance of the tent, lifting the canvas flaps slightly to look out across the compound. The barracks windows glowed with soft yellow light, while the guards continued their steady patrol along the perimeter road. Farther out beyond the fences, the endless wheat fields shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight, their tall stalks moving slowly with the night wind. The world outside the camp remained enormous and quiet, untouched by the small routines unfolding within the fence. Evelyn lowered the flap and returned to the desk. She gathered the medical charts and stacked them neatly before blowing out the lantern flame. The tent darkened immediately, leaving only the faint glow of the compound lights filtering through the canvas walls. As she stepped outside and secured the entrance flap behind her, the cool prairie air brushed gently against her face. She took one slow breath of the night wind before turning toward the path that led to the staff quarters. Across the compound, the prisoners inside the barracks had begun settling into sleep, their voices fading one by one as the camp entered the quiet hours of the night. Keller remained awake for a few minutes longer, listening to the distant sounds carried across the prairie. Eventually his eyes closed as well, the steady rhythm of the day finally drawing his body toward rest. The events of the morning drifted into memory like a simple story carried on the wind. A story without speeches or witnesses. Just a moment when someone had noticed another person standing too close to the edge of exhaustion and quietly stepped forward before that edge was crossed. Outside the fences, the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly beneath the stars, vast and patient as it had been long before the war and the camp that now stood upon its soil. And within that quiet land, two people from opposite sides of a conflict had shared a brief human understanding that no report, no regulation, and no fence could fully contain. The prairie night stretched wide and quiet above Camp Briarwood, the stars scattered across the dark Kansas sky, like distant lanterns that had watched over the plains long before fences and barracks had appeared on the land. Inside the prisoner barracks, Matthias Keller slept lightly, the kind of sleep that followed a long day of work when the body had finally received enough strength to rest without struggle. The steady breathing of the men around him filled the wooden room with a calm rhythm, broken only occasionally by the creak of a bunk frame or the soft turning of someone adjusting a blanket. Outside, the guards continued their quiet patrol along the fence line, their boots pressing slow patterns into the gravel paths that circled the compound. The war had brought these men from different countries to the same patch of prairie, but the night itself belonged to none of them. It moved across the land, with the same patient silence it had carried for centuries. Somewhere near the center of the compound, the small medical tent stood beneath the pale glow of the yard lights, its canvas walls shifting gently whenever the wind crossed the open fields beyond the fence. Earlier that evening, Lieutenant Evelyn Parker had closed the medical logbook and walked back toward the staff quarters, leaving the tent quiet until morning. Yet the memory of that morning remained inside the space like a quiet echo, a moment that had already begun turning into something more lasting than the brief actions that created it. Morning arrived again over the Kansas prairie the way it always did, slowly and without ceremony. The eastern horizon brightened first, turning pale silver behind the endless rows of wheat that stretched toward the distance. A few minutes later, the camp bell rang once again at 6 o'clock, the familiar iron sound rolling across the compound as the prisoners stepped out of their barracks to form the morning line. Keller moved among them with steady steps, his body restored by the previous day's meals and rest. The faint weakness that had threatened him the morning before was gone now, replaced by the quiet strength that came from ordinary nourishment and a full night of sleep. Otto Reinhardt noticed immediately. "You look ready for the fields today," he said quietly as they joined the line. Keller nodded. "I believe so." The men around them shifted forward slowly as the line began to move toward the mess hall doors. The smell of bread drifted through the morning air again, carried by the same prairie wind that had blown across the camp the day before. Keller stood calmly among the others, no longer balancing on the edge of exhaustion, but simply waiting for his turn like everyone else. Across the yard, the medical tent stood open once more as Lieutenant Evelyn Parker prepared the day's charts inside. She glanced toward the breakfast line briefly, the habit of observation that had become second nature during her months at the camp. For a moment her eyes settled on Keller among the prisoners near the middle of the line. He stood upright, steady, speaking quietly with Otto while the line advanced. She did not approach him. There was no reason to. The quiet purpose of the previous morning had already been fulfilled. Keller eventually stepped inside the mess hall and received his tray like the rest of the men. Bread, oatmeal, coffee. The same meal served to every prisoner each morning. He carried the tray to a wooden table near the window and sat beside Otto while the sunlight climbed higher over the prairie outside. As he ate, he noticed something small resting on the tray. The bread was slightly larger than usual, the cook having added an extra half slice without comment. Keller glanced toward the serving counter where the kitchen workers continued passing out trays to the men behind him. None of them looked in his direction. It was a small change, almost invisible among the hundreds of meals served each week. Yet Keller understood the quiet meaning of such adjustments. Systems were often built from tiny decisions made by individuals who chose to see what others overlooked. Later that morning, the trucks arrived again to carry the work crews back to the wheat fields beyond the fence. Keller climbed into the truck bed with the others, gripping the metal rail as the vehicle rolled slowly out of the camp gate and onto the dirt road leading toward the harvest rows. The prairie opened wide around them as the truck crossed the land, the sky enormous above the fields that moved like waves beneath the morning breeze. Keller watched the horizon for a moment, feeling the steady strength in his arms and legs as the truck carried them toward another day of labor. Across the compound behind them, the small medical tent remained at its quiet post near the edge of the yard. Inside, Evelyn Parker finished organizing the morning charts before stepping outside to watch the trucks disappear into the distance. She knew the camp would continue operating the same way it always had. The guards would patrol the fence. The kitchen would serve meals. The prisoners would work the fields until the harvest ended, and the long process of returning them home slowly began. Nothing in the structure of the camp had changed because of a single moment inside the medical tent. Yet something quieter had shifted beneath that structure. A recognition that even in a place defined by rules and boundaries, the smallest acts of attention still mattered. Keller never spoke openly about the details of that morning again. Years later, when the war had faded into history, and he had returned to a peaceful life repairing machines in a small workshop outside Hamburg, he sometimes remembered a particular day on the Kansas prairie when the wind carried the smell of wheat fields through a canvas tent. He remembered the calm voice of a nurse who had simply noticed a man standing too close to the edge of exhaustion and chose to act before that edge became a fall. And the lesson remained with him long after the fences of Camp Briarwood were gone. Not every moment that changes a life arrives with noise or recognition. Sometimes it is as quiet as a piece of bread placed on a table, offered without judgment and accepted without pride. The world rarely records such moments in official reports, but the people who live them remember. And in the long history of human conflict, those quiet acts of recognition often become the small threads that remind us that dignity does not belong to one side of a war or the other. It belongs to anyone who chooses to see another human being clearly and respond with simple kindness.